Okay. Good evening, and welcome to Bnei Jashurun. I'm Kobi Cohen, the Israel educator, and I'm excited to introduce Dr. Avi Shilon, who will talk to us about Menachem Begin and the political upheaval in Israel of 1977, when the Herut right-wing party won the election to the 8th Knesset and replaced the left-wing Labour Party as in Israel's government after 29 years. Dr. Avi Shilon is a historian. His PhD dissertation focuses on the revisionist movement leaders' attitudes towards Jewish religion in 1925 to 2005. He is the author of Menachem Begin's biography, David Ben-Gurion's biography, and the political and the decline of the left wing in Israel, Yossi Beilin and the politics of the peace process, that was published recently. Shilon is currently a visiting scholar at NYU, and he is also writes op-eds, columns for Haaretz. And good evening, Avi.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here.
And we're really excited to have you here. And today it's a special event because on May 17th, we're going to mark 45 years to the political upheaval. And in order to understand it and to get the context better, what made this political upheaval possible after 29 years of a really strong, control of Mapai and the Labour Party?
Sure. So first of all, again, thank you for having me. I think that the political upheaval of 77 is, I should look at you or there?
Whatever is more convenient to you, because...
Cool. So it's probably maybe one or at least the second most important event in the Israeli history. The ramification of the upheaval are, you can sense them even today. And it took Begin a long time to reach this point of being able to beat, actually for the first time, the Labour Party, or if to be more accurate, the Labour establishment. Now, in order to understand the importance of the upheaval, we should take into account that from the 20s, actually, until 77, from the pre-state era, until, as we said, almost the 80s, Israel and the Zionist enterprise in Palestine were controlled by the labor establishment, by Mapai. And when we are talking about controlling, we need to understand that Mapai was responsible for the cultural aspect of Israel, for the economical aspect of Israel, obviously about the political, the security perception of Israel. And when Begin won, he actually changed the face of Israel. Now, let me start with a depiction of the way that Begin underwent from 48. Let's start from 48, even though he was an important player also in the pre-state era, but today we are going to speak about the Israeli politics. So, towards the establishment of Israel, Begin decided to dismantle the underground, the Irgun, and to join the democratic game in Israel as a new party, Herut. Herut is freedom, which was based on the people of the Irgun and also the people of the revisionist party. And I wouldn't say a major segment of the Mizrahi population supported Begin from the beginning, because actually many of them supported Mapai in the formative years of Israel. But it was already from the first election, it was clear that there is some sort of a unique attachment between the Mizrahim and Herut. Now, Begin expected to be at least the head of the opposition in the first election. But unfortunately for him, he got only 14 seats, and many, even among his supporters, saw it as a disappointed They saw themselves as the liberator of the Jews from the British mandate, and they expected to get more. But the second election, which were held on 1951, was even more disappointing for Begin, because back then he got only 8 seats. If we want to understand this failure, we need to take into account that Begin was very devoted to the issue of the Greater Israel. And he didn't stop talking about the need to expand the border of Israel. And when you talk about it a lot and you emphasize the need to expand the border, when most of the Israelis were really fatigued after the War of Independence, many of them were newcomers in the Great Immigration who admired Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion looked like the Messiah of Israel. So Begin's message was not accepted by the vast majority of the Israelis. After this failure in 51, he even thought he was a man of honor. And when he was criticized, he usually said, I wouldn't fight for my position. If you think that I'm not good, I will retire. So he even thought about studying law and becoming a lawyer. And then when he took a vacation to calculate his next steps, he got a call from Israel telling him that there is a new and amazing news. Israel is going to get the reparation from West Germany. Yeah? For Begin, it was outrageous. He thought that it would be, from a lot of aspects, a huge mistake to get the reparation money from West Germany. And he came back to Israel to lead the protest against this agreement. Now, in that time, when Begin led the protest against the agreement, you could see many of Begin's traits and many of Begin's, let's say, his way of thinking. Because first of all, when Begin protested against the reparation agreement, he put emphasis on the issue of that we, the new generation of the Israelis, should not see ourselves as a new phenomenon, but as a chain in the Jewish history. And he said he had some very interesting argument against this agreement. First of all, he said that if you want to accept the agreement, you need to ask the previous generation. He also said that if you are going to accept the reparation, to get the money, in a way, and this was a very sophisticated argument, in a way you are approving the most anti-Semitite stereotype of the Jews, that in order to get the money, you are ready to do anything.
The greedy Jews, that's what you're saying.
Yeah, this is what Begin actually said. And he said that it is a blasphemy. The German people, or actually the Nazis, are like the continuation, the incarnation of Amalek. And he led a very emotional protest against this agreement. Eventually, the Knesset approved the agreement, so Ben-Gurion won. But Begin won the first step of legitimacy in the Israeli public, because it was the first time that he talked about issues which is not only the Greater Israel. He talked about Judaism, he talked about religion, he talked about morality, and I think that after, even though the protest that he led was very, let's say, emotional, to put it mildly, yeah? People tried to throw stones on the Knesset. Some of them tried even to breach the Knesset. You need to take into account that this agreement was revealed to the public only a few years after the Holocaust. Yeah?
And it was very emotional because of that, because literally it was, in a way, laundering the Germans' crime, but it was also times of austerity, and the young state of Israel really needed the money.
Yeah, obviously, I think that in a way, if you want to understand both sides, Ben-Gurion were obviously in favor of the agreement, and Ben-Gurion and Begin was against the agreement. I think that part of the debate should be analyzed by the fact that Begin was in the opposition and Ben-Gurion was the head of the state, because if you think about it in a rational calculation, obviously Israel were in huge need for the money, and I'm not sure that if Begin was the head of state, he wouldn't accept it. But on the other side, I think that if you really want to understand the Israeli society or the Israeli history, we were in need to have someone like Begin to protest against this agreement. Yeah? It could have been very pity or even awful if Israel was ready to get this money without any discussion, public discussion and debate. So in order to conclude this issue, I just want to say that I think that the fact that Begin led the protest against the reparation agreement was also the first step in his career to be considered by the vast majority of the Israelis as a unique leader who can unify many segments of the society against the government, because we need to take into account that when Begin led this protest, it was not supported only by the Irgun people. It was supported by Holocaust survivors, by the Mapam, the more radical left, by many of the Mizrahim, who were not Holocaust survivors, but obviously identified with the atrocity of the Holocaust, and many of the religious and the ultra-religious supported him. So this was the first step to gain legitimacy. The second step occurred later, around the mid-50s, when Begin decided to reach a hand to the liberal, to the general Zionist, הציונים הכלליים. Later on, he merged Herut with the liberals on the 60s, on 65. And by that, he projected himself not only as Ben-Gurion addressed him like a radical right wing, but as a, let's say, conservative or mid-right wing leader.
And he added an economics aspect to his agenda.
Exactly.
Which was, he was lacking it with Herut.
Exactly. By merging with the liberals, Begin also added the economical agenda to Herut, and they were against, let's say, in very general terms, because we don't want to delve into the economical issue, they were against what they saw as too much of socialism in Israel, which also harm civil rights. And this was the second important step that he took in order to, let's say, take control over the country, the merging with the liberals. The third point, which is important, is connected to the Six-Day War. In the what is being termed in the history, in the literature, the waiting period, the time in which the Israelis really were in anxiety before the war, Begin was invited for the first time by Levi Eshkol, who replaced Ben-Gurion, to be a member of the government. It was the first unity government. And we don't need to tell you that the Six-Day War was like the great winning of Israel. Israel actually tripled its size. And more important with respect to Begin is to understand that if before 67, Begin's ideology with respect to the greater Israelis were seen like an extreme ideology, after the Six-Day War, it became like the mainstream. Because the thing that Begin used to talk about, that we need to get back to Judea and Samaria, to the West Bank, and we need to get back even to Gaza and obviously to Jerusalem, actually materialized and were suddenly supported also by the Labour Party. So Begin's ideology, from being a radical ideology, became the mainstream ideology. We need also to take into account the change in the Labour Party. We mentioned it, the generational, but also the personal, because when Levi Eshkol replaced Ben-Gurion, Levi Eshkol took totally a different path than Ben-Gurion. If Ben-Gurion was someone that was willing to do anything to impose his will and to lead the people in accordance to his ideology, Eshkol took a different pattern of leadership. He was much more of a unifier. He was ready to bring the remains of Jabotinsky. He was ready, as we said, to include Begin in the government. And by that, he let Begin to have much more legitimacy, something that Ben-Gurion did anything that he could in order to prevent it. Another important event that, let's say, paved the way for Begin to the upheaval was the Yom Kippur War. 2 years before the Yom Kippur War, Begin decided to leave the government because he rejected the idea of a territory for peace, which was suggested by Rogers and the American administration at the beginning of the 70s. Begin never gave up on this principle for territory for peace, even though later on he was ready to give the Sinai Peninsula. He was ready to do it because he didn't see Sinai as part of the biblical land of Israel. Right. So he left the government on 71, and by that he had some luck, because when the Yom Kippur War broke out, Begin was not member of the government. And when the Israelis were really furious because of the fact that Israel was, let's say, unprepared to this war, and almost 3,000 soldiers were died in this war. So the Israelis protest against the government. And suddenly Begin looked like someone as a new alternative.
But he was still small at that time. I mean, even the elections after the war, Mapai, I think, won the largest amount of seats. It was 56 seats out of 120 in the Knesset right after the Yom Kippur War. But yeah, there's got to be something else, that another spice to the dish.
Yeah, you're right. I think in order to understand why in the immediate election after the Yom Kippur War, Mapai still got the majority of votes, and Begin, even though I think he grew stronger in this election, but not as he expected, we need to understand the issue of trauma. Usually, in order people used to say I'm traumatic, but trauma is something that you need to digest. It takes some time, yeah? So I think that immediately after the war, even though most of the Israelis were really upset, to put it mildly, they preferred to cling to the normal, not to do a huge change after the war itself. So it took several years, 3 years after war, 3-4 years after war, to really protest by voting, yeah? So in the immediate election after the war, Mapai won again. And the next election on 77 was the great moment of Begin. Now, we didn't mention another 2 layers that affected Begin's winning. One is the Mizrahim, yeah? As we said about trauma, even it's true also with the Mizrahim. It took them some time, yeah, to start and to protest by voting against Mapai. they needed the second generation of the Mizrahim to feel much more independent, much more powerful to protest against Mapai and to vote for Begin. And many of them, actually, they are the main reason, if you think demographically, for the great winning of Begin on 77. To my mind, we can talk about two major issues that connected or created the attachment between the Mizrahim and Begin. The first is the fact that for both sides, the right-wingers of Israel and the Mizrahim, both of them felt deprived by the Mapai establishment. Secondly, I think that even though Begin was Polish and he was Ashkenazi, he had an attitude toward the Jewish religion which was much in line with most of the Mizrahim, which means let's be traditionalists. We shouldn't rebel against religion like many of Begin's generation among the Mizrahim had done. But we shouldn't also be, let's say, too extreme with religion. Extremism, actually, if you think about it, it's much more of an Ashkenazi phenomenon than of a Mizrahi phenomenon. So in that case, the fact that Begin was a traditionalist fits the way most of the Mizrahim saw religion. Understand that the way to be Jewish. And also the fact that for Begin, Zionism, in contrast to Ben-Gurion and to the Labour Party, was not a revolution in the Jewish history, but a continuation, a modern continuation of the Jewish history. And because of that, Begin was much more at ease with all the Jewish tradition of the Moroccans, of the Iraqis, of the Algerians, of the Libyans, something that, and also of the Ashkenazim, yeah? Something that Ben-Gurion and the Mapai establishment wanted to change. They wanted to create a new Jew, while for Begin, it was, let's stick to the old classical Jew, but in modern ways, yeah?
So you can say in a way that he founded some sort of a coalition of the oppressed.
Yeah, in a way, he founded the coalition of the oppressed. I mean, now you are taking me to the coalition that Begin founded.
Yeah, I mean,
so first of all, he won. He won for the first time. In Hebrew, it's the Ma'apach, something which is huge, but less than Ma'apecha, which means less than a revolution. So the right term is upheaval. There is a new film, by the way, The Upheaval, and I highly recommend to everyone to watch it. And Begin won the election, but it's not enough because in the Israeli system, you need to establish a coalition. And yes, he established a coalition of groups that were on the margins of the Israeli society, which means the ultra-religious, yeah?
What we know is the ultra-Orthodox parties.
The ultra-Orthodox party, Agudat Israel, for example, which were absent from any coalition since '52, were ready to join the coalition. Begin opened the ranks of the Likud to many young Mizrahi leaders, which later on became the skeleton of the Likud. And for Begin, a few step that he took on 77, to my mind, really shaped the current Israeli society. For example, he expanded the exemption of the ultra-religious from serving in the army. For him, it was important. It was important because he believed that maintaining the Jewish heritage of the diaspora is something important in Israel. He
saw it in the ultra-Orthodox.
He identified or let's say recognized the ultra-Orthodox as the remain of the diasporic Judaism. Obviously, you can think differently because historically speaking, it's also a modern phenomena. But for Begin, it was like they symbolizes the classical Judaism. Another important, and by the way, I think that today, in the current era, people taking for granted the fact that El Al is not flying the national company.
National airline, yeah.
Yeah, airline company is not flying on Shabbat and holidays, but it wasn't like that. It was Begin who said that in the Jewish state, it's better off for the national airline company not to fly on the Shabbat, even if they are going to lose money, because the Shabbat is more important than money. Yeah, I think that the way Begin merged nationalism with religion is something which is very much evident in the current Israeli society. Just to give you a few folkloristic examples, today it's very common to each and every elected prime minister to go to the Western Wall.
Right.
Nobody did it before Begin. It's very common if you look at the commander of the Israeli army of today. They also, in their commands, you can read many times, merging stories from the Bible, from the Jewish religion, with concrete military mission. And it's something that Begin, I think, at least pushed for, this amalgamation of religion and nationalism. Obviously, in the economical part, Israel before 77 and Israel after 77 is a total different Israel with respect to economical issue. Israel became much more liberal. Later on, Israel became neoliberal society, and by that I think Begin would have been disappointed, because Begin was not a supporter of neoliberalism. He had some socialistic traits. It was very important for him to address the poor people. And Begin also helped to change Israel culturally. I think that in the at least last 2 decades, Israel is underwent what I can call the process of itmazrechut, Easternization process. The Israeli culture is much more about, let's say, Oriental music, Mizrahi music. The food is different. You know that, by the way, up until the 80s, the Israeli government refused to subsidize pita, yeah, because pita was seen like the food of the Arabs, and they were ready to help you to subsidize only bread, because bread was like the Jewish food. And today in Israel, obviously, pita is the Israeli classical food. And I think that the fact that Begin was very much inclusive toward the Mizrahi culture, and not only, by the way, toward the culture, also in terms of economical issues, he pushed to restoration of poor Mizrahi neighborhood. Yeah? And as we said, he opened the ranks for Mizrahi young leaderships. Begin was also the first to order the Mossad to bring the Ethiopian community into Israel. So I think that in many cases, and there is another issue.
The refugee boat of the Vietnamese.
The refugee boat is something which is important to Begin, was important to Begin mainly as a lesson from the Holocaust. And he always wanted to project the fact that during the Holocaust, let's say that not many helped the Jews, if to put it mildly. They wanted to project the fact that the Jews, the lesson of the Holocaust wouldn't be just to have a strong Jewish state, but also to help to minorities in trouble. But I wanted to talk about the Begin doctrine. I think that the fact that Begin ordered the Israeli army to bomb the Iraqi nuclear reactor, even though
that's in 81.
That's in 81 in
June
81 in his second term, became like the guidelines to the future Israeli leadership. And we can see that I don't recall, I think it was in 2007, Israel bombed also the Syrian nuclear reactor, as a continuation of the Begin doctrine. The Begin doctrine was like, if to put it in at the risk of oversimplicity, was like, we should never let any enemy state to possess a nuclear reactor or weapon. And obviously we can see that today, even though let's say, to really succeed stopping the Iranian from having a nuclear weapon is a much more complicated mission than to bomb the Iraqi nuclear reactor. Still, the doctrine itself remained. The Israeli government is trying to do whatever it can in order to stop the Iranian from having nuclear weapon.
So if we circle back, we're talking about a lot of things that Begin changed in Israeli society. I want to ask you, first thing, you were talking about the peace process. And eventually, he did start with, his policy was, in Hebrew, it was af lo shal, not a single piece of land. And eventually, he did end up giving up almost all of the Sinai Peninsula, but he did keep the Gaza Strip, with the Palestinians. How do you explain it, and why eventually leaving the Gaza Strip in our hands?
Yes, it's a good question. I think that Moshe Arens, who were a very stern revisionist and also the defense minister, he wrote in his memoir that he was let me put it differently. First of all, Begin had the image of a radical right wing. This is why when he decided to have peace with the Egyptian, it was like a huge surprise. But I found that on 75, 2 years before the upheaval, he said explicitly to his followers that the Sinai Peninsula is totally different from the land of Israel. And the Sinai is a strategic asset. So in order to gain another strategic assets like peace with Egypt, which was like the major enemy of Israel, it would be okay to give up on the Sinai Peninsula. Now, Arens told Begin, I'm totally opposed your idea to give back the Sinai Peninsula. But if you're insisting to do so, at least give them back Gaza also. Why should we have Gaza? It's only a trouble. And why should we take control of so many Palestinians? So Begin told Moshe Arens, and Arens said, I was shocked. How dare you? In the Bible, Gaza is part of the land of Israel. The Sinai is not. So Begin, in this way, again, it's part of his ideological perception of merging traditionalism with nationalism. It's also part of his, let's say, he was really, he admired Jabotinsky. And for him, in the revisionist party, the land, the Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, was a major part in their ideology, and he was never ready to give up on the land of Israel, while he didn't see the Sinai Peninsula as part of it. If you're asking me if he really planned to give up the entire land, including the airports, including to evacuate the settlers, maybe not. Maybe not. I think that he believed that he would be able, in the negotiation, to convince the Egyptians and the Americans for a better deal, because shortly before he went to Camp David, he told to his minister, and Begin was an honest man, this, to evacuate all of the settlers from the Sinai Peninsula, would be to cross a red line for me. But at the end of the negotiation, when he realized that it's take it or leave it, having peace or not, he decided that if we will relegate the decision to the Knesset, because he always believed in the democratic idea that the Knesset should decide, if the Knesset would be in favor of such agreement, he would sign on it.
Interesting. So, and then I want to touch another point. You mentioned his, I would say, his connection with the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. And if we talk about the service in the army, Ben-Gurion gave a quota of what we call Talmidei Chachamim, and eventually Begin, I would say, open up, he stopped the quota. And today you have a situation that most ultra-Orthodox, I would say that almost all ultra-Orthodox, don't actually serve in the army, and they are not a coherent part of Israeli society in a way. Do you think that that was Begin's intention, or do you think that he was blindsided in a way by his deep, I would say, Jewish sentiment?
Yes, I think that from, when I made the research for the biography, I read the testimony of the head of Agudat Israel, and he said, we didn't even need to ask. Begin suggested it. And as a secular Jew, I also think that Begin was correct. I think there is something nice to... First of all, we need to be realistic. I don't think that the Israeli army is really in need of this, all of the ultra-Orthodox in the army. We know, each and every Israeli know that there are even redundant soldiers in the army. Yeah? So you don't need everyone. Secondly, Ben-Gurion, when he was ready to accept this quota of 400 yeshiva students, Ben-Gurion believed that it's like keeping some kind of museum. Ben-Gurion believed that history is going in a linear way toward progress and people will stop being religious at all. So if there are 400 crazy Jews that wanted to maintain their habits, let it be, it's no worries. For Begin it was different. Begin really thought and Begin believed in symbols. And Begin really thought that in the Jewish state, after which was like the fulfillment of the Jewish history, we cannot ban Jews from studying in the yeshivas. Yeah? And I think that for Begin, seeing yeshivas people praying was really a sort of strength. Yeah? And as I said, as a secular with some attachment to the Jewish religion, I think that it's totally fine. I also want to add that I'm not sure that the ultra-religious community is getting more and more disconnected from the Israeli society. I think it's even on the contrary. First of all, now we have a special unit of ultra-religious soldiers in the army. Secondly, slowly, but it happens, they are much more engaged with the Israeli politics, with the Israeli society. You cannot stop, the iPhone, you cannot stop the internet, and they are part of it. And I think that, I know that many secular Jews are really furious on the ultra-religious that they are not being conscripted to the army. But if you want to think about it in good faith, I think that this is something which is unique to the Jewish state. If you want to have a Jewish state without being unique, so why having a Jewish state? And in this case, even though I have my own criticism of Begin, in this case, I think he was correct.
And I want to ask you now about what we call the Mizrahim in Israel. I remember a testimonial of Meir Abargil of the Black Panthers. He lived in a small neighborhood called Musrara. Now almost nobody can buy a home over there, but when he lived there, it was a slum. And I remember that he was, his testimonial, that he said that he remembered, the people of Tel Aviv and the people coming from all over the world to see the old city. and they would just go through the people. They won't see, the Mizrahim who lived in those slums. Begin really caught that sentiment, and he did a strong effort to narrow the gaps. Do you think that eventually he succeeded, or it took a lot longer time to work, to narrow the gaps?
Yeah, first of all...
And also, what actions did he took?
Yeah, first of all, the Black Panthers of Israel didn't like Begin.
Right, they were socialists.
More than that, they didn't like the idea of Zionism. So for them, even though Begin was much connected to the Mizrahim, Begin was part of the establishment. They saw Begin as part of the problem, not part of the solution. But the Black Panthers, which were a very, very interesting group, and today there is some revival of the Black Panthers, we need to take into account that most of the Mizrahim rejected the Black Panthers. Yeah? Now, with respect to Begin and the Mizrahim, it goes back even to the pre-state era. I think, again, because Begin was much more open to, by the way, many don't know it, but when Begin became the commander of the Irgun, one of his first orders was not to operate during the Shabbat, only in special conditions. So many of the Mizrahim, which were much more traditionalist, were part of the Irgun even before the establishment of the state. Begin did an important, let's call it job, in letting the Mizrahim to express their culture. He also, alongside Yitzhak Shamir, we need to mention, opened the rank of the Likud for an authentic Mizrahi young leaders. Yeah? And Begin also pushed for the restoration or of the poor Mizrahi neighborhood. In Hebrew, it's Project Shikum Shchunot, because he had a very interesting perception. He said that he was criticized that he is investing too much money in new decoration of houses instead of investing the money on education. But Begin said something interesting. He said, if you are not living in a nice house, you will never have the energy or the ability or the will to get a good education. So obviously Begin did an important job for the Mizrahim, but we need to remember that it took a while, and it not only took a while, the gap is still there. Yeah, it's not that Begin fixed the problem, but he obviously was one of the major reasons for the, let's say, the revival of Mizrahiyut in Israel.
And I want to touch one last thing about Begin, and that's his relation with the Israeli Arabs, actually. We didn't talk about them, and they were never a part of the coalition in Israel until the current government. But Begin actually supported civil rights, and he was opposed to Ben-Gurion and the military ruling in Arab society until the late 50s. But what was his relationship with the Israeli Arabs? How did he envision their part in Israel?
Yes, this is an important question to conclude, because usually people tend to associate right wing with anti-Arabs. In the Israeli case, by the way, the issue of left and right is totally different, because usually the left wing is more liberal and the right wing is more conservative. But because the left wing of Zionism came from the socialistic way of thinking, they were much more for the collective and less for the individual. Yeah? And the right wing of Zionism was much more for the individual than for the collective. So for Begin, when Israel was established, Ben-Gurion decided to put all of the Arab Israelis, which were back then, and by the way, until today, almost 20% of the population, under military regime. Why? He didn't trust them. Secondly, in his eyes, those people were the enemies, were the guys who fought Israel just a few days or months ago. And thirdly, because Ben-Gurion thought that precisely because we won in the War of Independence, which is the Nakba for the Palestinians, they wouldn't forget. So we need time. He actually adopted the Iron Wall of Jabotinsky. We need the time in order to have really an egalitarian state. We cannot trust them. They can be very quickly a fifth column. Begin, which came with much more democratic values and much more for him to protect civil rights, individual rights was very important, said loud and clear, in a democratic state, you cannot put your citizens under military regime. Now, we need to be accurate here. It's not that Begin just wanted to cancel the military regime. He wanted some sort of other kind of surveillance, yeah? It's not that Begin said, oh, I believe them all, they're going to be peace. But Begin respected the idea that if you are a citizen, it doesn't matter if you are Jewish or an Arab or a Muslim or a Christian, you should have the same rights. So Begin and Herut voted to cancel the military regime, something which happened only after Ben-Gurion's retirement on 64. And for Begin, and I tell you it honestly, he was very stern and very, let's say, even aggressive with respect to the land of Israel and obviously as the commander of the Irgun. But I never saw, or actually it's more accurate for me to say read, something racist that Begin said on the Arabs. On the contrary, he respected them, and many of them respected Begin. He even, by the way, ordered the security service of Israel never to use torture against Arab, because this is not how a security service should act in a democratic state, and it was also the result of him being interrogated by the Russian when he was in Europe.
So if we want to conclude, when we look at Israel today, in 2022, 74 years old, what do you think, if Begin was alive today, would he say oy vey, or who would be so proud of what happened since 77?
Yes.
Of what we accomplished?
You know, nowadays, and this is for another discussion, Begin become like the example of the left of how you should rule, while in the young generation of the right is being perceived a bit differently. But I think that Begin would have been proud. I think the amalgamation of religion and nationalism is something that he pushed for. I think that the peace treaties with Egypt proved itself to be one of the major components of Israel's security. Yeah? More than 40 years. I'm so bad in math, I think around 40 years. And still the peace is holding.
45 years.
45. I think the Abraham Accord is some kind of the extension of the peace process with Egypt. I think that Begin would have been would be very happy to see the Mizrahi culture thriving, the Ethiopian community, the fact that Israel is much more liberal than it used to be in the days of Ben-Gurion. And I think also the connection between the American Jewry and the Israelis is still something which is very strong, and is something which was important for Begin, by the way, when he wanted to help the Mizrahim in the poor neighborhood. He said that I don't want that the government will sponsor everything. I want that the American Jewry will be part of sponsoring this project, not because the Israeli government had no money, but because he wanted to unite the Jewish people outside and inside of Israel. And I think that generally speaking, Begin would have been satisfied. By the way, I'm not sure if Ben-Gurion would have been satisfied, but Begin for sure.
Well, So Avi, I really want to thank you for the conversation.
Thank
I believe
you.
that we can go for another couple of hours because there is a lot of depth to go over here. But I really appreciate your time and thank you for enlightening us. I would also like to thank the people who joined us today in the sanctuary and online. BJ is happy to bring you these types of program at minimal low cost. Right now, you can support BJ and our programs by participating in our spring benefit, which is taking place next week, Thursday, May 19th, in person and online, just like this event. You can visit the BJ website to purchase tickets to make a donation. If you enjoyed the program tonight, please help us provide more opportunities and join us at the benefit. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night and for many other events.
Thank you,
Avi.
Kobe, for your smart and kind question.
Thank you.